He bought everything money could buy: art that hummed with provenance, a house that swallowed noise in its marble corridors, a security system that could map a visitor's heartbeat. He had not bought, no ledger could have tallied it, a person who could steady the pitched panic that sometimes came over his adopted daughter like a summer storm. Leah's scream cracked against the foyer tiles, sharp as dropped crystal. It made the chandeliers seem too bright, made the house recoil into the hush it reserved for its most fragile things. Hands moved, first the nanny, then a maid, then Guillaume himself, who had been at his desk 3 flights up when the sound reached him. He came down without thinking. The sight on the marble floor stopped him in the doorway. The little girl was small enough to be wrapped in a single arm, knees tucked under, hair plastered against her temples by frantic fingers. Her palms were over her ears, fingers splayed as if trying to push the world into a smaller shape. Her breath came in tight, flittering huffs. The muscles in her neck were taut. In those seconds, Guillaume felt the helplessness of someone who could buy anything, but could not buy what she needed. Mirella was already there. She knelt low, the hem of her uniform whispering across the tile, and she did not speak loud or scold. She reached with a quiet that felt like an offering. Her voice came at first as a hum, thin and steady, the kind of sound you might make in a rainstorm to reassure yourself. It was the same melody she had sung to her brother when he had convulsed on their small living room floor years ago, the same pattern of notes threaded through the sleep she had learned to weave around other people's children. It was not necessarily pretty, it was urgent and practiced. Leah's small body began, slowly, to follow its rhythm. The transformation did not look like a miracle. It resembled a tide pulling back. Her breath lengthened, her hands slackened. The knuckles around her ears loosened until they rested, palm to palm, on her lap. Guillaume watched, chest ache and disbelief braided together. He had been the one who'd signed the adoption papers, who'd named her and set the house's routines around therapies and specialists. He had been countless places, doing the business of the company that had made his fortune. He had read reports and insurance forms and email updates that filtered his daughter's life into bullet points. He had thought himself observant. He had thought himself present. Standing there in the doorway, he could see, with a kind of pubescent shame, that there were things in Leah's quiet that he had never known how to touch. "Her name is Leah," Mirella murmured, as if offering the room a fact to rest upon. "She likes the window at dinner time. She likes the rhythm on long rides. She likes things when they come the same way each day." Guillaume's jaw worked. "I know," he said, and it came out small. Words were poor currency now.
He stepped forward, reluctant to break the fragile seam Mirella had sewn between the child and the world with her voice. He lingered at the threshold as if the house were a courtroom, and his daughter's calm and undecided verdict. Leah's eyes opened. For a beat she looked straight at his face, clear, searching, then lowered them to Mirella's hands. Then she reached, slow, and placed a small, sticky palm over Mirella's. She did not smile in the way a child in a movie might. She blinked, decided, and went on breathing. When the house returned to its measured hum, when the staff retreated to whisper among themselves, Guillerme finally crossed the white tile. He sat on the edge of the sofa and watched Mirella. He wanted to ask how she had done it, to catalog the steps and make them replicable, reproducible, transferable. He had health plans, workshops, a short list of accredited programs. Nothing in a contract would teach the gentleness in Mirella's right thumb as it rubbed the soft skin where Leah's wrist met the forearm. Mirella glanced at him, and there was no vaudeville flourish of humility, no expectation that he would hand out praise like currency. She folded Leah into the crook of her arm and hummed the song once more, lower, to anchor the girl's breathing, as if the lullaby were a rope tied round both of their waists. Guillerme felt something settle, a small, dangerous thing. Recognition. He was not used to the fact of being seen by an employee in a way that unsettled him. The household lived on an axis of economies. There was money, and then there was everything else. Mirella's competence was taken for granted in receipts and schedules and medical updates. To see it made flesh, to witness its effect, was to see an unrendered cost he had been oblivious to, the quiet labor that kept his daughter anchored to the world. A single discreet overlay on the screen, a small polite pop-up in the corner, would be the first signal for anyone watching this story as a show. Like if you believe caregiving can change a life. Guillerme's fingers closed around the fabric of the cushion with an odd, new protectiveness instead. After the lullaby, the house resumed its choreography. There were appointments, there would be notes to specialists, there would be insurance forms and meetings, but a new thing moved between the man who had everything and the woman who had given everything she could in other, humbler economies. That thing was not yet love. It was a recognition that wealth without witness had holes in it, and that someone like Mirella was a kind of seamstress. They kept their distance in public. Mirella stayed at her station, preparing Leah's meals with that small, precise ritual she had learned in her family kitchen, lining up soft scarves that Leah could use to feel the edges of textures, keeping stretches of predictable time so Leah could anticipate the day without the violence of surprises.
Guillerme kept his distance in a different way. Behind diplomacy and schedules, he was present for the essentials and absent in the little minutiae. Yet at odd intervals, when a drone of helicopters cut across the sky, when a boardroom win required private celebration, he found himself crossing corridors, lingering at open doorways, watching Mirela apply something like tenderness to things that were fragile. Mirela's own life was not a blank page where this mansion's marble filled the margins. She had come from a narrow apartment 3 neighborhoods away, a place where the landlady disapproved and the kettle always had a ring of old tea. Her mother, Lourdes, picked herbs for small sums and stitched collars for men who only noticed the seam when it gave. Her brother, Pedrinho, had been the first child she learned to calm. He had convulsed once in the doorway of their home, and she had hummed a shaky lullaby that had seemed to carry him back into a body that belonged to him. He died a long time ago, an illness that had not been dramatic so much as stubborn, and his absence had taught Mirela a certain economy of care, how to fold grief into the small daily attentions that kept others breathing. It was not only grief that qualified her, it was the way she had worked with kids who did not always speak in sentences, who mapped the world with texture rather than names. The municipality had a small program where she had volunteered, and over the years she had learned training techniques from therapists, a kind of practical knowledge that did not come with certificates that glowed in file folders. She had empathy and history and an inventory of songs made of soft consonants, not scheduled pillboxes. She also had need. Lourdes's back had been a small argument with life. There were prescriptions to be paid and a mother to be carried to doctor visits. Mirela's pay was modest by the household standards, but essential at home. Money had never been a motive that could be bled into her bones. She did not imagine that wealth in and of itself would change her, but she did imagine, and often, because need teaches strange bravados, that someone could notice the care she gave without reducing it. Guillerme noticed. He noticed in small, indirect ways. The way he began to arrange his afternoons to be home for Leah's therapy sessions rather than call in from a hotel. The way he left little notes for Mirela when the house moved to a new schedule. The way his eyes followed her hands during dinner when she crumbled a slice of apple into smaller, easier-to-manage pieces for Leah. Recognition, when it came from a man who owned more than most countries held, had a curious weight. The first time the family encountered the woman who would come to threaten all that subtle equilibrium, she arrived like a headline. Vittoria had the polish of someone for whom public image was an economy of its own.
She had been absent for years. The paperwork on the adoption had recorded a protracted separation, a period of rehabilitation, and then silence. Her return was theatrical, an interview filtered through glossy frames, a sanitized narrative of recovery and renewed maternal calling. She walked into the house with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She walked into the staff room later with a different kind of weapon, a tongue designed to sort people into their places. Vittoria's version of motherhood was loud and performative. She favored statements that set themselves up to become quotable. At the first formal dinner she attended post-return, she surveyed the staff as if they were props, and then, like a conductor finding a wrong note, she corrected them in public. It happened over coffee, small as a pebble. She called Mirela help in a tone that flattened. In the dining room, she made a joke about the house's help setting the table properly, the kind of throwaway cruelty that functions as a sluice, washing away someone's dignity for the entertainment of others. Mirela, by temperament, did not answer in kind. She had long ago learned the economy of restraint, a refusal to burn bridges where bridges carried food and medicine. But Guillerme saw what he had not known how to see before, the way Mirela's shoulders sank, the small muscle in her cheek that twitched when she smiled, as if she were folding pain into a private corner. He felt a sharp, ingrown anger. It was a thing he had rarely carried forward. He told himself it was misplaced because he was a man in a suit defending his employee from a woman with a household pedigree. He also felt, with a clarity he had not anticipated, that his daughter had been humiliated. The humiliation to be witnessed is what the title promised. The billionaire's adopted daughter was humiliated by the stepmother. The phrase might lead the public to imagine cinematic scenes, slaps, screens on a grand staircase. But the humiliation here was quieter, the kind that curls into a child and makes her quieter in turn. When Vittoria corrected Leah at a family gathering, instructing her to behave like other children in front of guests, Leah's small hands went to her ears, as if to stem some flood. Guillerme saw Leah's face fold inward. He saw Mirella's hands twitching as if she wanted to scoop Leah up and vanish. That glance, Guillerme watching it all, lodged into his chest. Vittoria's cruelty was strategic. Her remarks were rarely dramatic enough to be indefensible in a complaint. They were gestures of superiority cloaked as guidance. "You should take more interest in your daughter's education," she told Guillerme once, not as a question, but a verdict. "Children need structure, they need discipline, they need proper standards." Her voice carried the kind of authority that rides on social standing, on having friends who could name influential board members and socialites who would signal for her in charity circles.
Her words found purchase in layers of the household. Donna Eulalia, Guillerme's mother, who valued lineage and accomplishment like a currency, warmed to Vittoria because she spoke a language of propriety. She made small, cutting comments about Mirella's background to visiting cousins. In Eulalia's eyes there was a calculus. Status plus proper lineage equaled rightful influence. Mirella, who had grown up where lineage meant the names of the people who had kissed your cheek, understood that she was being unmoored by a system that measured worth in social dust. Vittoria's return had a public face and a private hand. She began the bureaucratic process that always followed power. Petitions, consultations with lawyers who could write in elegant, convincing language. She began to plant stories in the press, a whisper about the father's neglect, a framed anecdote about the adoptive father who had left it to his staff. The idea was simple: seed doubt so that it takes root. Guillerme felt the weight of accusation in a way he had not for his business. In commerce, he had been a man of calculated risks, tailwinds and hedges. In family, he felt exposed. He authorized lawyers to answer, to file denials, to request mediation. He called people he trusted for counsel. He felt guilt, a large, human sort of guilt, for having been absent at the times Leah needed someone most. That guilt ate into his patience, into his sleep, into the way he counted his days. Vittoria's move to legal action was not sudden. It was escalated, polished. Her petition sought increased involvement in Leah's life under the language of reunification. The petition promised rehabilitation and attendance at parenting classes, the sort of formal precedents that read well in court. It was by design paper perfect. It argued that biological ties held a certain legal gravity that should not be dismissed. The law, Guillerme's lawyers told him in neutral rooms with laminated coffee tables, often considered biological connection a significant factor. The adoption did not erase every relevant claim. The document was a call to process that would be public and humiliating in a way that mattered. It would peel back the family's private difficulty and make it an object for judgment. Mirella felt exposed too, in ways both small and large. The house's staff room became a place where people spoke in tentative alliances and soft confessions. Sonia, the longtime babysitter who had first taught Mirella the routes of the household and who had watched Leah grow in the ways only a caregiver can, stayed near. She had known Mirella since before the readouts and the reports. Sonia's loyalty was steady as a floorboard. She carried memories like receipts, proof of hours, the stitches in the caregiving fabric. The staff did not speak loudly about the legal papers. They spoke in small truths, the kind that retain their power when collected.
The first public humiliation by Vittoria that truly cut was not aimed at Mirella, but at Leah, and yet it struck Mirella the way an arrow strikes a shield. At a charity luncheon thrown by a trust donor who moved in circles where favors and alliances were the same thing, Vittoria corrected Leah in front of a table of people who mattered. Leah had been looking at a leaf on the table as if it were an artifact, and Vittoria, with a smile thin enough to be distorted, told the child to look at other children, behave like she was taught. Leah's small hands went to her ears, and she began to rock slightly, the way one might rock to ride out a tremor. Mirella stepped forward as if pulled by a rope. She wanted to pick Leah up and leave, to shield her from the biting light. Guillerme moved as well, but not to stop his ex-wife's words as he might have in another life. Instead, he held himself back with a kind of stunned, reverent hesitation, as if he were watching someone deliver a blow he'd never thought possible. Vittoria's face did not change. She watched the reaction she had provoked and catalogued it as success. In a house that measured correctness in degrees, she had made a point. That evening, Guillerme stood before the ledger of life, lawyer invoices, press mentions, social feedback, and realized the arithmetic of influence was not the arithmetic of his heart. He could bribe courts and movies, he told himself, but not real courts, not the ones that move slowly and weigh decisions in the bedrock of precedent. He could not buy the reversal of every careless sentence said by people who thought themselves entitled to instruct others on how to be human. Vittoria escalated in other ways. She cultivated allies among the staff's acquaintances who frequented the outer rings of high society. Image consultants crafted statements she could say with conviction about reconnecting and restoring proper maternal roles.
An account created on a parenting forum, anonymous of course, spun a thread alleging neglect, a mosaic of impressions that when collected suggested a pattern. In the age of smartphones, an accusation need not be accompanied by proof to generate pressure. It only needed people to look. People who look and judge are as dangerous as people who act. Not long after the charity luncheon, a sleek envelope arrived in their legal department. It was a formal request for supervised visitation pending an investigation into guardianship. The court had not yet heard the matter fully, but the petition was begging a single urgent thing: access for commissioning professionals to evaluate reunification potential. A judge, with the gravitas of a man who read files like the rest of the planet read novels, had signed an order recommending supervised visits while further assessment occurred. It was an order designed to minimize risk while opening the house to scrutiny. Guillerme sat with the paper on his lap and thought about the image of Leah covering her ears.
He felt suddenly like someone in charge of a fragile botanical specimen who had been asked to present it to a committee that would judge its right to sunlight. He called Dr. Camilla Moraes that night, a soft-voiced child psychologist whose presence in their lives had been an anchor. She had seen Leah in early sessions and had a temperament that balanced skepticism with hope. When he told her the court's provisional order, she did not flinch. Supervised visitation is a neutral measure when courts are dealing with uncertainty, Dr. Camilla said with clinical calm. It's meant to protect the child while the court explores reunification potential, but it must be implemented with caution. Children like Leah can experience regression, an increase in anxiety, altered sleep, sensory shutdown, when placed back into environments that are unpredictable or emotionally charged. Guillerme felt the words as a cold talon. Could it hurt her? He asked. It could, she said. Not necessarily, but the risk is real. Reunification can be beneficial if done slowly, if it's structured and safe, supported by therapists. But if the parent has not truly stabilized, if their lifestyle includes unpredictable stimulation, or if there is shaming, that is the worst context for them. Regression is not a moral failing, it is a response. Then what do we do? Guillerme's hands had that peculiar billionaire's habit of clenching, which was not unlike any other man's when he felt outmatched. You document everything, Dr. Camilla said. You demonstrate patterns. You prepare your caregiver to be a witness. You limit exposure if signs show distress. The language of procedure was both a balm and a threat. It suggested a path, but it also implied that there would be bridges to cross, testimony, exhibits, the slow unspooling of private life into a public record. It was in that liminal space, the one that separates the private from the procedural, that Achillean politics began. Vittoria called for visits, and the press clucked at the narrative. Guillerme hired an investigator with an impeccable resume, Mauro, an ex-police officer turned private investigator, who had the quiet aura of someone who had once seen too much to be easily impressed. Guillerme authorized Mauro to gather evidence that would be admissible: timestamps, receipts, properly handled photographs, recorded statements taken with chains of custody intact. He insisted upon the ethics of legality. He had a lawyer's sensitivity to the fragility of evidence. Mauro nodded as if Guillerme's stipulations reminded him of old police protocols he still respected. Mauro's work was patient and methodical. He did not plant photographs for headlines. He collected small facts in a ledger, receipts from bars, transaction timestamps, security camera footage from a club with clear timestamps and witnesses, and he stored them the way an archivist keeps fragile things.
He interviewed people who had environment knowledge, landlords, bartenders, acquaintances who could place Vittoria on nights when she promised to be at home. He sought to demonstrate either neglect or proof of attempt at rehabilitation, and he did it with the steady patience of someone who believed in documentation. Vittoria, for her part, was not idle. She responded with a PR rhythm that understood how perception could move a judge's pen. She scheduled a series of highly polished meetings with social workers, the sort of performative rehabilitation that read well on paper, a therapist's invoice here, a workshop certificate there. She understood the language the system respected and adopted it for herself. Her efforts made the court's provisional order look like the first measure in a long tug-of-war. Mirella watched all this with a weariness that felt personal. She had never asked for the public stage. Her life had been armor and patience, a slow accumulation of small triumphs. Yet the world turned under her like a stage light moving across the scenery. She counseled Leah through the small sins of their day: a favorite mug broken by an inattentive guest, a change in the timing of a therapy session, a late-night party upstairs that had not been properly announced. Each upset could be a chisel at Leah's stability. Each humiliation visited upon Leah was a pinch toward a deeper anxiety. There was a moment in this first spiral of escalation that underlined the limits of money and the cruel reach of status. Vittoria, pressing for advantage, made a cutting remark in the staff corridor that was meant to be private, but landed in the air like a thrown stone. "You people," she said, using the word not as descriptive but as a weapon, "you're useful but replaceable." The implication was clear. Loyalty was optional, decoration was required. For Mirella, the remark was not merely insult, it was a threat to her moral fabric. She had long been careful with her dignity because it was a currency that kept her family inside their apartment with enough food on the table. To have that dignity threatened by someone who could not feel its cost felt like an act of cruelty. Guillerme answered not with a speech but with a small act that mattered to Mirella. He extended her a contract, formalized her role beyond daily pay. He insisted she had benefits and a path for professional development, the means for her to attend the municipal training she had once dreamed of finishing. It was not a grand romantic gesture, it was a practical reparation. Mirella accepted, a little stunned, because the offer acknowledged what she had done and what she might yet become beyond the household's walls. Vittoria's legal action continued. The court's supervised visitation order came to be scheduled on a slow, rainy day that left the house smelling of wet stone.
Leah was led by a social worker into a neutral room, a place designed expressly to have no ornaments that might overwhelm a child's senses. The supervised visit lasted an hour. It was the kind of hour that could not be unmade and would leave marks. When Leah returned to the house afterward, she was different in a way that made Mirella's stomach drop. She was quieter, yes, but that was not the only change. She stirred jam absent-mindedly on her plate, a small motion that usually meant she was processing. Later, she withdrew into a corner and refused the stuffed animal that used to comfort her. Her eyes seemed smaller, drawn inward. The child who had once responded to a melody with a clear, deliberate hand now sat with the body of someone who had braced for impact and expected it again. The visit, supervised though it was, had landed as a wave on a coast that had not recovered from previous storms. Mirella sent a text to Dr. Camila. Her message was a short, clinical mapping of behaviors: decreased appetite, heightened startle responses, resistance to previously reliable cues. Dr. Camila replied with professional steadiness and concern. "These are signs of regression. We must document them. Keep a behavior log. We will request an expedited review of visitation conditions." The logistics were clinical, almost bureaucratic, but the stakes felt elemental. Guillerme stood in Leah's playroom with the behavior log in his hands and felt for the first time in a long while the absolute vulnerability of being a parent caught in a system that had its own tempo. He could clear an office and pay retainer fees by the boatload. He could not instantly recalibrate the psychology of his child. He could hire Mauro to gather the receipt of negligence. He could not buy back the quiet certainty in a child's chest once it had been rattled. Vittoria saw the change as a tactical advantage and pressed further, her public statements shaped to suggest a man incapable of caring for his adopted daughter without her guidance. The press, hungry for lines that could be repeated as frames for opinion, clipped her phrases and repeated them like charms. Guillerme's world narrowed to burnish the argument: secure custody by private means or by public vindication. He took legal steps to ensure that every piece of evidence was handled correctly, that every medical professional's assessment was recorded, that every observation had a timestamp and a witness. He wanted the story in a courtroom to be as clear and incontroversial as one of his company's audited accounts. Mirella's place in the narrative was ambivalent. She was the quiet, steady center who had soothed the worst of Leah's storms. She had become, overnight as it seemed, both a balm and a target, the object of Vittoria's disdain and Guillerme's quiet admiration. She had no desire for drama. She did desire the right to keep doing what she did without being weaponized in someone else's fight.
She did not see herself as a heroine. She saw herself as someone who had learned to hold a breaking thing together until it could learn again how to hold itself. When the guardianship's clock ticked toward a formal hearing, the house's corridors felt like the intervals between heartbeats. People moved with measured speed. Mauro delivered packets of timestamps and receipts and watched Guillerme sign them with that distant, odd look people have when they are witnessing an encroaching narrative about themselves. Sonia rehearsed small answers in case she was called to testify. The hours, the long string of days she'd seen Mirella stay late at night to ensure Leah slept, the evidence that the care was consistent. And underneath all of this, the lullaby persisted, a motif like an echo in a building that reverberated only when someone made a sound soft enough to allow it. Mirella hummed it in corners, hummed it when Leah slept, hummed it in the staff room when the house's gossip felt like a low static. It was a small music that kept making her remember Pedrinho and the nights of small heroic measures. The first part of the battle would not be settled quickly. The legal order for supervised visitation meant an escalation that would stretch into days and weeks of observation, of interpersonal negotiation and professional assessment. It would mean evidence collected by Mauro filed by Dr. Armando Freitas, the calm defense attorney Guillerme had hired, and answered by Dra. Nadia Esteves, the sharp opposing counsel Vittoria had chosen. There would be depositions, clinical reports from pediatricians, and the inevitable human testimony where loyalties would be probed. For now, in the quiet between the first crisis and the first court order, the household held its breath. Guillerme found himself standing in Leah's doorway one night, watching her sleep. The lullaby seemed to be folded into the way she breathed. Mirella stood by the window with a cup of tea, the steam ghosting away in the low light. She thought of Pedrinho and of Lourdes, of small economies and larger truths. She thought of the contract he had offered her, formal recognition, a pathway to training, and felt strange gratitude and the wary knowledge that formal recognition would not protect them from all things. Across town, Vittoria prepared statements and scheduled meetings. She had reasons she believed were legitimate, a conviction that biological ties should not be dismissed easily. There was a ferocity to her claim that came out of a life that had, perhaps, been disordered as well. But her methods brimmed with a hunger for restoration that in its ardor failed to consider the child's fragile place in all of it. The tension tilted toward a point where choices would have to be made: containment or exposure, deference to expertise or reliance on public persuasion. The house which had swallowed noise for years now made room for a sound that was not easily mended.
Leah's small body had signaled distress, 1,000 tiny responses that made the stakes clear. And somewhere on a rainy morning, when the house had only the sound of rain against stone and the steady, small chorus of the lullaby in a staff room, Guillerme received another envelope. This one bore the court seal and listed a provisional schedule, supervised visitations to be reevaluated, and administrative hearing to map the way forward. Lees of the decision settled into the legal calendar like silt. They would be sifted, argued, and slowly, with the dryness of legal machinery, converted into a narrative that might, or might not, protect Leah's life of small consistencies. Mirella folded Leah's blanket with a practiced hand and placed it where the child could find it by touch. The lullaby hummed at the edge of the day, persistent and soft. Outside, the world had opinions and headlines. Inside, there were small things: the exact angle of a spoon, the smoothness of a favorite cup, the regularity of a walk to the garden at 3. These were the unglamorous scaffolds that would be the evidence of a life well cared for if anyone chose to look beneath the glossy surface. The first act of the story closed itself not with resolution, but with preparation. Guillerme promised himself he would watch everything now. He would not be a spectator. He would sign paperwork and sit through depositions. He would, reluctantly and finally, admit that money could buy no guarantee, but could fund the patient, thorny work of documenting truth. Mirella, who had never wanted the lights, kept humming and arranging and steadying. The lullaby was her prayer. It had no theology beyond repair. Leah slept through rain and the low concerns of adults above, and in the morning she would stir, reach blindly for a hand that had comforted her once, and may yet again. The house waited for the next scene. Evidence would be gathered, witnesses would be prepared, hearts would be called to testify in their own way. The squeal of a child in a foyer had become, in a way neither of them could have predicted, the first articulate line of a public argument about what it meant to care. The house carried on with its small daily certainties, but each ordinary motion now felt like preparation for an audience. Mirella kept the lullaby in the margin of everything she did, humming under her breath as she folded Leah's clothes, the melody a soft counterpoint to the harsher sounds of legal paper and television commentary that sometimes drifted through the staff room. Guillerme filled his head with lists and legalese, the way people fill silence with safe, repetitive things. He met with Dr. Armando Freitas and listened as the defense attorney laid out a patient architecture of evidence and testimony. He read Maurer's reports the way he once read quarterly projections, carefully for patterns. Mauro had given them a binder the size of a small Bible.
It contained photos with timestamps, copies of receipts, ledger entries from venues where Vittoria had been seen late at night, and interview transcripts. There was, Mauro said plainly, a way in which proof was boring. Small, repeated details that made a picture of behavior when assembled. A club membership swipe at 2:12 a.m. on a night that Vittoria had testified she was at home. A bar tab, a hotel folio, a neighbor who could corroborate the sound of music coming from an upstairs window. The evidence did not have the pleasant symmetry that a crime drama might prefer. It was a mosaic of neglect and contradiction. Mirella sat in on some of the legal briefings because there would come a time when she had to speak in a room where her life was a subject for cross-examination. She watched Mauro explain chain of custody to Dr. Armando, who nodded in appreciation of details handled the right way. If we are to show pattern rather than exception, Dr. Armando said, the integrity of the evidence matters as much as the content. His voice made the sentences sound clean, the way a surgeon's steadiness makes the scalpel look like the right kind of instrument.
Mirella felt both relieved and terrified. Relieved that someone insisted on doing this properly, terrified to imagine herself as a witness in a legal theater. The house's steadiness attenuated under pressure. Vittoria increased her public-facing nostalgia for motherhood and scrubbed whatever tenderness she could project into press statements. At the same time, she pressed the visitation schedule and made sure the court could observe Leah in varied settings. Guilherme was determined to follow Dr. Camilla's cautionary advice. Allow the court's procedures, but fight to keep Leah's safety paramount. He agreed to supervised visits only because the order required them. He chose the least intrusive format and insisted on having therapists present who knew Leah's triggers. The first few supervised visits were antiseptic affairs: neutral rooms, a social worker at a sanitized distance, a clock carefully documenting the minutes. Leah's eyes tracked the edges of the furniture. The first visit lasted an hour. It yielded nothing dramatic to report, yet afterward Leah's sleep pattern frayed. The second visit produced more measurable strain. The child, who would usually interact with tactile toys, instead clung to rhythm, tapping her hand along the armrest until her knuckles blanched. That night she refused the bath she usually liked, and in the morning she pushed her plate away. Mirella and Dr. Camilla began keeping a daily behaviors log with the kind of specificity the court respected: timestamps, antecedent events, observable behaviors, and how they resolved. It read like a clinical map: 0915, increased startle on high-frequency sounds; 1300, refusal to engage with preferred toy; 2045, regression in sleep pattern. Each line was a small, declarative plea dressed in professional notation.
It was not melodrama. It was evidence of harm. Vittoria's PR team did what PR teams do. It framed every delay as resilience, and every insistence on faster reunification as compassion. Her supporters wrote op-eds about the sanctity of genetic ties and the importance of giving parents a second chance. The arguments were familiar in language, unfamiliar in the household's immediate danger. For Mirella, watching these pieces felt like watching wind moved through a garden. It disturbed things at the surface, and over time, loosened roots. The staff's loyalties became a visible network. Sonia volunteered to come in early and keep a detailed chronology for the house, not only of Leah's behaviors, but of the ways in which daily routines were disrupted by visitors, unannounced dinners, and the small social maneuvers that wore on a child's sense of safety. Sonia's testimony, when the time came, would be straightforward and raw with detail: the nights Mirella had stayed late, the lunches she had rearranged to maintain rhythm. Her words carried weight not because they were polished, but because they were consistent. Mauro's investigations turned up more than club receipts. He found a series of audio snippets, recorded, he insisted, only after his initial interviews with acquaintances had produced corroboration, in which Vittoria spoke of placement and institutions with a lightness that Dr. Camilla's skin crawl. One recording, backgrounded by laughter and a glass's clink, contained a sentence that would become central: "If she keeps like this, it would be better to find a place where they can specialize. I can't be here all the time." To a parent, this might sound like a negotiation of options. To a psychologist listening for danger, it sounded like a plan spoken without the gravity it required. Mauro presented his materials to Dr. Armando in a secure meeting. The attorney read the transcripts and watched the wave pattern of the audio. "This will not prosecute her," he said quietly, "but it will undermine the narrative you want to sell in court, the idea that she is ready and stable. It contradicts the invoices and certificates she'll show. It's about credibility." Credibility, he meant, would be the fulcrum on which the judge would pivot. Dr. Camilla submitted a clinical report that was measured but blunt. She wrote about Leah's regressions in language courts use: persistent anxiety symptoms consistent with disruption following unpredictable or shaming interactions, and she explained in a section that would be read aloud in chambers the kinds of behaviors Leah exhibited and why supervised visitation, in a context of a parent who had not yet demonstrated sustained predictability, might be harmful. Reunification is best when parents demonstrate consistent, protracted stability in routines and responses, she wrote. Short-term performative rehabilitation in front of court is not sufficient for a child with Leah's sensory profile. The sentences were clinical, but carried the weight of someone who had held a hand over a child's narrow, quick breath and watched it slow. Depositions were scheduled. Sonia, Mauro, Mirella, and Dr. Camilla met with attorneys before the formal proceedings. They rehearsed facts and clarified memories without inventing detail. Guilherme watched Mirella prepare and felt a discomfort that threaded his admiration with shame. He had watched her at work for months and had never considered the possibility that the world might call her trustworthy, a thing to be argued. She had always been steady without witness. Now she would be steady before strangers who might pick holes. When the hearing day arrived, the courthouse smelled of lemon oil and paper. The courtroom itself had a functionality that dampened theatrics: a bench for the judge, a table for counsel, a gallery for those who wished to observe but be unseen. Cameras were present at the outer doors. They did not intrude. The judge, a woman in late middle age whose hair had the softness of someone who had read the law as if it were a language of kindness, took her seat with a gravity that made everyone in the room momentarily remeasure themselves. Vittoria sat in a way that suggested certainty. Her counsel, Dr. Nadia Esteves, was sharp and practiced. She presented the rehabilitation documents, the therapy invoices, the parenting workshops, the records of attendance that showed that Vittoria had been making industry-standard steps. Dr. Nadia's questions were crisp, designed to be efficient rather than performative. The optics suggested a woman who had invested in reform and was now ready to reunite. Dr. Armando's opening was less about flourish and more about method. He laid out an agenda: document the pattern of past neglect where it existed, demonstrate the risk of regression, present witness testimony that would support a conclusion that Leah's best interests lay in a slow, carefully monitored path to any increased parental access. It was a procedural argument disguised as a shield for a child. Sonia went first. She spoke with a quiet authority that comes from repetition and observation. "I first noticed a change when Leah began to avoid eye contact with newly arriving visitors," Sonia said. She described the nights Morella had stayed late, the way she had steadied Leah after episodes, the rituals that supported the child. A line from her testimony would later be replayed. Morella didn't do things by luck. She learned them the hard way. It was not a theatrical line. It was the truth. And in a courtroom, truth tends to pierce. Dr. Camilla took the stand after the pediatrician, whose medical assessment had corroborated the presence of anxiety and sensory sensitivity, and she spoke to what professionals hate to say in public, that sometimes good intentions and legal procedurals arrive out of sequence.
Reunification can be protective, she explained, but it must be balanced against the child's immediate needs. We often mistake the vigor of a parent's presentation for readiness. For Leah, what matters is sustained predictability and an environment that does not subject her to shame triggers. The words were clinical, but they carried an implied moral weight. Care, she reminded the court, trumps performative penance. Maurot's turn to present the evidence arrived like a slow turning of a key. He showed photos with timestamps: Vittoria entering a club at a time where she had told a social worker she would be at a parenting seminar, a receipt from a hotel, a grocery delivery that showed no children's items in a month where a child's household usually included baby supplies. He played audio in court after chain of custody documents had been submitted and accepted by the judge for review. The recording played, and the room listened. In a clip, Vittoria's voice, light, almost laughing, said the phrase that Dr. Camilla had flagged: "If she keeps like this, it would be better to find a place where they can specialize. I can't be here all the time." The sound of the judge's pen scratching the page was the only other sound in the courtroom. Vittoria's counsel attempted to contextualize and minimize, to suggest that a single remark taken out of a broader narrative was insufficient proof of unfitness. Dr. Nadia cross-referenced invoices and certificates that suggested earnest attempts at rehabilitation. "You have to read the whole record," she said. The defense acknowledged those documents but argued that the audio and patterns of behavior created a material inconsistency. Then it was Mirella's turn. She had, for weeks, rehearsed with Dr. Armando the factual center of her testimony: times, events, specific behaviors. She did not rehearse emotion because her feeling was always the same in the raw, a steady, aching protectiveness. When she stood before the judge, she spoke simply. She described the lullaby that calmed Leah and the small routines that helped the child anticipate the day. She described the nights she had sat by Leah's bedside and the times she had rearranged a day because of a sound the child found unbearable. She did not plead beyond truth. She did not ask for poetic recognition. Her testimony worked like a slow light, illuminating small details: the time Leah refused to speak to a tutor after being corrected publicly, the time the child covered her ears at a family lunch. She answered the opposing counsel's questions without artifice. Dr. Nadia asked in a voice that could be sharp when it wished to be, "Is it your position that Miss Vittoria posed a danger to Leah?" Mirella's answer was careful. "I don't think she meant harm. I think she didn't understand how terrible these moments are for Leah. For Leah, shame is like a storm. She needs calm." That sentence, that a child needed calm more than anything, seemed to rearrange the courtroom's terms. It was less an argument and more a statement of priorities. The judge scribbled notes. The moment that would later be replayed in news bites and referenced in private conversations arrived not as spectacle, but as a quiet and human pivot. The court had agreed, under careful stipulation, to bring Leah into the gallery for observation.
She was in the care of a third-party social worker and had been prepared by Dr. Camilla for the unusual environment. The room was not full. It was only those whose presence mattered: attorneys, experts, the judge, and a small cluster of people related to Leah's immediate life. Mirella sat with her hands folded. Guillerme stood near the doorway, an island of stillness. When Leah entered, the way she moved made everyone in the room notice. She did not stride, she did not announce. She walked with a careful, deliberate cadence. Her gaze scanned the room the way someone checks for exits. For a long moment she did not look toward anyone she might know. Then her eyes found Mirella. It was not a cinematic recognition. It was the way someone reaches instinctively for a known landmark on a foggy evening. She moved toward Mirella with the small, precise motion children make when they choose a refuge. Mirella reached out and took her hand without speaking. Leah rested her head on Mirella's shoulder for a beat, and then, in a sound that was thin but unmistakable, she said a name. The court, which had rehearsed in the sterile language of documents and exhibits, received a spoken syllable that carried the weight of all the unquantifiable things evidence cannot always capture. Mirella, she said. It was a word and a verdict at once. The room exhaled collectively. Guillerme's face, which had been carefully composed, flooded with an emotion that made his jaw tremble. Relief braided with recognition and the sting of previous absence. The judge allowed a pause, a legal courtesy that also felt like a humane recognition of what had happened. Nothing in the room needed to explode. The child had spoken, and the sentence contained its own momentum. Dr. Camilla later described to the judge, in a tone that was both professional and human, why that moment mattered. Attachment is not demonstrated solely in reports. We look for behavioral markers that point to a consistent caregiving relationship. When a child seeks a specific person in an unfamiliar context, it is a strong indicator of attachment security. Her words were careful. Attachment is a spectrum, not a binary. But that day, Leah's behavior provided a powerful data point. The judge, binding all the procedural threads into a single articulated decision, listened to the testimony, reviewed Maurer's evidence, considered the invoices and certificates Vittoria had provided, and weighed the clinical reports. She read each document as if it were an argument for a child's life.
Her writing hand moved with the deliberation of someone who understood the gravity of altering a family structure. When she spoke, her voice was neither theatrical nor cold. It was exact. In matters concerning a child's welfare, the court's duty is to prioritize safety, predictability, and the child's best interest, she began. This court finds that, at present, the available evidence demonstrates a risk of regression in Leah's well-being when exposure to shame-based interactions occurs. The audio recordings, corroborated by time-stamped evidence and witness testimony, raise questions about the suitability of unmonitored reunification at this stage. She paused, and then articulated the ruling. Vittoria would not be granted increased custody. Supervised visitation, which had been the interim measure, would be suspended pending a thorough, court-approved rehabilitative plan demonstrated over a substantial period and verified by independent professionals. The court ordered an immediate extension of protective measures around Leah's environment and recognized the documented caregiving patterns Mirella and the household staff had maintained. It ordered that Mirella be formally recognized in the child's care plan and stipulated benefits to ensure continuity of caregiving. It was not a complete sweeping vindication. Nothing in the judge's ruling pretended to be final, but it was clear, measured, and grounded in evidence. The judge emphasized that the court preferred rehabilitation over punishment, but that rehabilitation could not be merely performative. True reunification requires demonstrable, verifiable changes over time, she said. This court will not gamble with the emotional stability of a child on a public story. Vittoria reacted with the kind of theatrical disappointment someone who expects sympathy from the gallery practices. She spoke of injustice and misinterpretation. Her counsel promised appeals. Social media erupted into polarized commentary. Some called the ruling a triumph of science over sentiment. Others accused the court of excessive paternalism. For the household, however, the ruling felt like a clean intake of breath after a long, panicked inhale. That evening, Guillerme sat in Leah's playroom and watched the soft lines at the corner of his daughter's mouth curve as she did something small and content with her hands. He had not sobbed in court. The courtroom was not for sobbing. But later, in a private place where the house did not feel like a stage, he told Mirella what he had felt when Leah had reached for her. "You saw it," he said, voice tight. Mirella shook her head in a way that suggested she did not require praise. "She needed me to be what she knows," she said. "You saw her flinch. You know the rest." He closed the distance, and for a rare moment in their public, professional lives, allowed himself a small human indiscretion. He took Mirella's hand.
He did it not as a patron, but as a man who wanted to say in a language less measurable than legalese, "I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. I will try to make it right." The aftermath of the hearing recalibrated more than the legal calendar. Mirela received a formal contract that day, as the court had urged recognition as part of the child's care plan. The contract included a benefits package, paid time for professional development, and a clause for flexible scheduling that acknowledged the unpredictable nature of Leah's needs. It was not a romantic gesture in the style of a movie proposal. It was a practical acknowledgement that the household could not, in good conscience, rely on the unremunerated labor of someone whose family depended on her income. For Mirela, it meant possibility. Classes with the municipal program whose brochure she had once kept folded in a drawer. The chance to pursue a certificate in special care she had always promised herself. Vittoria filed motions and prepared appeals, her team energetic in the engine of litigation. The public conversation did not quiet. It altered tenor. For a while, commentators could be heard debating attachment theory, legal rights, and the obligations of adoptive parents. But within the mansion, the priorities were repair and routine. Dr. Camilla recommended a stepped plan of reintroduction for any future contact that might occur, one that required verified stability from Vittoria and incremental exposure for Leah, with professionals present at each step. Guilherme, who had always tracked investments and quantified risk, learned the difference between money that bought services and money that purchased trust. He increased his involvement in Leah's day-to-day in small ways that mattered. He changed his travel schedule to be home for certain sessions. He sat in therapy meetings not as a passive stop, but as an active participant willing to tweak his life for his daughter's predictability. He set up a scholarship fund that would pay for Leah's long-term therapies and for Mirela's education, a practical redirection of resources that made some at the house uncomfortable because it was not flashy, but profoundly necessary. Mirela's life began to tilt in slow, steady arcs. She enrolled in the municipal course that had once been only a dream folded into pay stubs. She studied sensory integration techniques and communication strategies, and she learned the technical vocabulary that belonged to professionals. The knowledge did not make the work easier, but it made her confident in the kinds of ways that benefited Leah directly. The romance between Guilherme and Mirela that the world might have expected to declare itself with fireworks evolved with the same incremental care that had characterized everything else in their lives. They guarded against making choices that could be interpreted as transactional or as power imbalances.
Their closeness was negotiated with attention to professional boundaries, conversations about schedules, about the boundaries of employer and employee, about the ethics of affection when money and power are anyway present. Over time, months rather than days, they let small human gestures knit them together, a shared look across a room during an appointment, Guilherme learning to slow the speed of his questions when Leah needed silence, Mirela accepting a cup of coffee from his hand in a way that suggested mutual respect more than indebtedness. One late afternoon, months after the ruling, Guilherme asked Mirela to meet him in the house's small, underused garden. The light was soft, and the air had the smell of jasmine. He did not create a spectacle. He did not speak in the language of cliff-top declarations. Instead, he reached into his pocket and took out a simple ring, nothing ornate, but crafted in a way that suggested intention, and asked if she would consider a life in which they might be partners in private as well as colleagues in public. Mirela considered the ring the way she considered other significant things, quietly, practically. "I don't want to stop working," she said. "I don't want to change who I am for anyone's ease." "If you never worked again," Guilherme said, "I wouldn't want you to. I want you to be yourself. I want us to be a family the way Leah will understand it, reliable, honest, steady." She smiled. It was not a surrender. It was a mutual recognition. "Then let us be careful with the word family," Mirela said. "Let us earn its meaning." They married later in a small ceremony that honored both practicalities and intimacy, a discreet registry, a dinner with those whose presence meant the most: Sonia, Lourdes, Dr. Camilla, Mauro, friends who had helped in quieter ways. Dona Eulalia attended, a softened figure who had watched events unfold and learned, with difficulty, to measure value beyond social pedigree. Vittoria did not attend. She remained a public figure who continued to challenge and to press appeals, but the court's ruling had shifted the playing field. In the years that followed, Leah's life unfolded like a careful tending of a garden. There were setbacks, a noisy renovation that upset a pattern and brought a series of small regressions, an unannounced charity event that left Leah off balance for a week, but overall there was steady improvement. Therapies continued. Dr. Camilla and the pediatrician met regularly with Mirela and Guilherme to evaluate indicators: increased spontaneous play,
reduced frequency and intensity of sensory shutdowns, improved sleep patterns. The lullaby persisted as a motif. Sometimes, in moments of achievement, Leah would hum it herself, a thin, imperfect echo that filled both Guillerme and Mirella with a quiet shared joy. Mirella's training progressed.
She completed her certificate and began working part-time with a local community center, teaching parents how to build structure and sensory-safe spaces at home. Her life stretched outward in ways that made her mother proud. Lourdes began taking short walks and returned to her herbal sales with a held head. The family's economy grew not only in bank numbers, but in the casual dignity of self-respect. Vittoria's appeals continued for some time in the media, but they grew less centralized in the household's life. Over time, she tried to arrange supervised interactions that followed a court-approved method: verified attendance at a long-term rehabilitation program, quarterly assessments by independent professionals, measured, structured exposure to Leah in controlled settings. Some progress was made, slow and imperfect. Leah, for a time, consented to brief interactions that were...
There were questions that would not be sealed: the ethics of love across a class divide, the unavoidable power differential between her and Guillerme, the ways in which social commentary would look at them with curiosity and sometimes contempt. They answered some of those questions aloud, and some with the everyday of their choices. They made sure Mirella's salary was independent from their life together, that her professional identity remained intact, that she pursued study and community work with autonomy. They argued like people who cared about the same handful of things: rigorous care, mutual respect, the danger of paternalism masquerading as kindness. On a late spring morning, several years after the first foyer scream that had changed the family's trajectory, Guillerme found a small drawing Leah had made, tucked between cookbooks in the kitchen. It was a roughly rendered heart and a figure beside it, both labeled with short, careful letters. Mirella found him holding the paper, smiling in a way that felt to him like an honest accounting of his heart. "She keeps things," he said, voice low. "She remembers the small hands of the people who help her." Mirella put a hand on the back of his neck and leaned in, a small human braiding of life. "We keep each other," she said, "in the ways that matter." The public story of the case would later be summarized in articles and podcasts as a test case about wealth, parenting, and the rights of adoptive families. For those who lived inside it, it was less about headlines than a map of what it took to keep a vulnerable child safe: patience, documentation, professional humility, and the ordinary love that shows up in the practice of routine. The lullaby remained a signature of that practice, a melody that had no grand theological claim, but functioned as a bridge between a small woman's history of loss and a child's fragile claim to peace. When the appeals were finally exhausted, and Vittoria's requests were limited by the court to very specific therapist-led interactions, there was no final cinematic unmasking. Instead, there was the slow erosion of legitimacy in public opinion for the kind of performative rehabilitation that had marked her early return. She kept trying in ways that were sometimes earnest and sometimes self-protective. The court's insistence on measurable change had changed the terms of the game. It did not erase pain, but it raised the bar for who could claim the status of being a safe attachment figure. In the quiet household that had learned to balance wealth with tenderness, the trio that mattered most, Leah, Mirella, and Guillerme, sat often in the small kitchen, where light came through a window at certain hours and the world seemed manageable. There were no guarantees for the future, only the knowledge that work continued: therapies, legal footnotes, the ongoing business of adult relationships. They did this work with a kind of learned humility.
A few years on, Mirella was invited to speak at a community center about caregiver dignity and the ethics of care. She spoke not as someone who had turned trauma into spectacle, but as a woman who had learned the hard grammar of steady presence. Her talk was practical: routines, how to listen to a child's sensory world, the importance of documentation in bureaucratic systems that prize visible credentials. She received no polished trophy for her labor. Instead, people in the audience thanked her with the kind of gratitude that comes when knowledge is offered without demand. The household's final image in the arc of this story, one that began with a piercing scream in a marble foyer and the hush that followed, was not of dramatic vindication, but of a small domestic tableau. Leah, older and steadier, sat at the low table and built a house out of blocks. Each block was placed with attention. Mirella hummed the lullaby under her breath, an unrehearsed refrain that had become a public but private signature. Guillerme, with his sleeves rolled, placed a block beside Leah's work and did not attempt to arrange it for perfection. He left space for the child to lead. When Leah looked up and offered a crooked, personal smile, it felt like the answer to the long argument that had unfolded in courtrooms and press rooms. The child had been humiliated, witnessed, defended, and ultimately protected in ways that were neither tidy nor simple. They had done their best, as families do, to respond with measured measures: evidence, therapy, legal safeguards, and the long, small work of affection. And as the late sun slanted through the window, Mirella's lullaby rose, soft as light. It had no power to erase the past, only to make the present steady enough to hold a future. If this story makes you think about the lines between compassion and power, or about what it means to stand up for a child who cannot always speak for herself, share your thoughts below. Did they do the right thing? What would you have done in their place?